Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. This video is going to be all about my least favorite shade in the palette. I did a favorite shade in the palette video a couple of weeks ago and I asked whether you would be interested in seeing me do a least favorite shade in the palette, and a lot of people said yes. Again, I've made a selection of 20 random palettes from my eyeshadow collection and I'm going to talk to you about them and pick my least favorite shade from each one of these. Sometimes it's performance, sometimes it's just a shade I don't like, etc, etc. There are different reasons here. And I have to say, I found this a lot more difficult to find than favorite shades. I usually register my favorite shades a lot more thoroughly perhaps than, oh, I don't really like this. But there were definitely a couple of things that I knew I wanted to feature in here. So that's why I'm going to talk you through these palettes and the shades that I don't really like. I will be swatching them on my hand for you, and a little bit of my arm perhaps, because else we'll be running out of space, I think. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get to my least favorite shades in 20 different eyeshadow palettes. So the eyeshadow palette that's on top, I nearly dropped bringing everything up here, so I'm glad it hasn't shattered. This is the Essence Rain or Shine Color Me a Rainbow palette, and it's an eyeshadow palette that also has a couple of face products in here. Let me see if I can hold this a bit better. And it has a couple of really interesting duochromes here at the top, and those are actually quite nice. But this icy white shade, if you look at this, I mean, it feels okay. It feels nice and creamy and all that, but then it's just really sheer. It's more of like a top coat almost, and that goes for almost every single eyeshadow in here. It's definitely just not the best, and it's just really glittery and just a little bit patchy as well, the swatches. So oh, I forgot to tell you that in the previous video as well, but at the end of the video I will make sure to do a close-up of all of the swatches so you can see a little bit better. But yeah, this is just not, I wasn't impressed with this at all. It just doesn't perform very well. And these shimmery, like icy white shades, they are not my favorite to begin with. So this kind of also is an example of a shade that I just don't like. I don't like these very frosty white shades. I pretty much only wear them as an inner corner highlight. That's about it. So they're not very versatile in my opinion. A much more expensive eyeshadow palette that I pulled from my collection is this Makeup Forever one. This is the Artistic Eyeshadow Palette. This was a limited edition for Christmas a couple of years ago, and I bought this because I wanted to try the Makeup Forever formula very much. And to be quite honest, I wasn't very impressed. And whether it's because this is a limited edition palette, so they kind of skimped on the quality of these, and that the full-size ones are a lot better, I'm just not sure. But again, you get a very shimmery white. This black is just not really great. They swatch nicely, but they feel very dry, and I just had a very difficult time getting these onto my lid. Look at how thin that looks. It's pigmented, it's okay, but it's just quite sheer, and it's just not really my favorite. There's one shade in the palette that I really like, which is this one, but also this pinky purple shade has a very thin texture. So I have to say, I'm afraid that I'm not very much in love with the Makeup Forever formula at all. A palette that I think a lot of people love is the Too Faced Chocolate Bar, but there are so many shades in this palette that don't really work for me very well. Overall, this is a little bit too dark for me. Everything I do with this turns out to look like a smoky eye. The quality of the shadows is amazing though, but this Candied Violet shade, Too Faced has these weird mattes with shimmers, and while it's pretty, it's just one of those shades that I feel it's a bit, again, very thin. It just doesn't swatch the best. It does have a nice bit of sparkle, but I feel that with a brush, the sparkle usually just dissipates and it just goes everywhere. So these kind of shades I'm not a big fan of, and Too Faced has a tendency to put these kind of shades in almost every single one of their palettes. So Candied Violet in the Too Faced Chocolate Bar is not my favorite. Catrice eyeshadows can be a little bit hit and miss. This is the Professional Artist eyeshadow palette, and when I saw this, I was super intrigued because I was like, wow, a 16 pan eyeshadow palette from Catrice. And I like quite a few of Catrice's eyeshadows. They are a bit chalky, a little bit powdery sometimes. They definitely need to be built up. But there are shades in this palette. There's a pop of burgundy here, and you have a green here, and especially this green. It looks quite nice when you swatch it, but on the eye, this shears out to look like a taupe. And it just doesn't really stay looking as nice as it does. You can already see it a little bit in the swatch that it just has a very sort of cool sort of undertone to it, so it kind of makes it look like everything else that's already in the palette. But it's also one of the very few pops of color you get in here, but it just doesn't really turn into that pop of color that I was hoping it to be. It swatches nicely, it just doesn't really go very well with the shades that are also in the palette. I also put some Zoeva palettes in this video. This is the Blanc Fusion. I really like Zoeva eyeshadow palettes, but this one has a very yellow gold. Think yellow gold and then up it again a notch, because this is pretty much a yellow with a little bit of golden shimmer. That's how I would describe it. And yellow golds, they're just not my cup of tea to begin with. They don't go very well with my skin tone. Look at that. I think that if you have a very dark skin tone, that shades like this will look absolutely stunning on you. But on my skin, because I'm more like cool neutral in my undertone, it's just a very stark contrast. Silver is also, like, metal wise a better look on me than gold to begin with, and the more yellow toned the gold, the more it sort of is not in line with my skin tone anymore, and that's why shades like this usually don't really work for me very well. It can still be nice. I have used the shade before. As you can see, it swatches very nicely, but I just don't really like what it does for my complexion. And we can't do a least favorite shade in the palette without talking about some Urban Decay, especially I feel in their limited edition, like Christmas collections and like Vice palettes. Those kind of palettes usually have a couple of dud shades in them. Case in point, this was a Christmas release, I think from 2 or 3 years ago. This is the Full Spectrum palette, and it's such a fun palette. Now, do I use this a whole lot? No, I definitely bought this more because I'm just a collector of Urban Decay palettes. But this shade up here, it's called Jones's. It's like it looks like a very stunning, like, light orange with a bit of shimmer. This doesn't build up. Usually, if an Urban Decay shadow doesn't work for me, I can build it up, or it looks really nice over a glitter glue. But this just barely does anything. It's so thin. It swatches nicely. Again, finger swatches, of course, never really tell the entire story. But again, it has a very thin texture, meaning that the color payoff just isn't that great. This is definitely more of like a top coat as well, and I really don't want to be bothered with a top coat, to be quite honest, when I do my makeup. I just want a shadow to go on and look vibrant and shimmery when I put it on, and not this like, oh, I need to layer something else underneath it to really make it pop kind of thing. It's just a meh kind of shade. Not my favorite. Shall we talk about this? Modern Renaissance is, of course, a lot of people's holy grail, and it's not mine. And it's not mine because a lot of the neutrals that are in here are quite warm. My favorite shades I've told you before are these like berry shades. But this orange, no. And these two shades I really don't understand, because on my complexion, raw sienna and burnt orange just look the same when I put them on. So to me, this isn't a 14 eyeshadow palette. A 14 eyeshadow pan palette, but it's more like a 13. But especially this Real Gar shade, it's just, it doesn't really work for me. It's just, again, with my skin tone, it's just not the best. It looks a little bit more red now I swatch it and not as orange, but I don't know. It's just a little bit, like, as you can see in the swatch as well, there's like a darker patch in the middle. It's just not a shade that I reach for. It's also kind of like hidden at the end there. It's just one that I don't reach for. I always forget it's in here, and I feel it doesn't look really great on me as well. Makeup Revolution then, of course I had to feature them in this video too. This is the Flawless Matte 2. Yeah, I got the right. I was like, did I get the right palette? Because I also have another Flawless palette. This is an all matte palette, and one of the gripes I have with these kind of palettes by Makeup Revolution is that, yes, you get 32 shades, but they are all very similar. I bought this mainly because it had those like nice pops of color over here, but this blue, really, no. That's it there. It's just a bit dry, chalky, and it looked a lot nicer on my finger than it does here swatched. Even in a finger swatch, it doesn't really go on very well. Again, it's a bit sheer. It just doesn't really do very much. And that is just such a shame because Makeup Revolution does some really, really nice eyeshadow. It's just that a matte dark blue, it's not something they can do very well. At least not in this palette. A palette that's quite new to me is this Eye Tech palette by Annabelle. This was sent to me over from Canada when I did a swap. And this actually really surprised me because some of these shades are actually quite nice. You do get two creams inside of a powder palette, which I'm not a fan of. And you get a gold, you get a silver, you get some nice neutrals. And I thought that this looked very pastel in the pan, but when I used it on my eyes, I was actually quite impressed with everything except for the silver. The silver, it looks quite nice on your finger, but it's so dry and powdery. Can you see that? I'm not sure if you can see, but it's just so dry, so powdery. You just get a bunch of shimmer, and it's like there is no base pigment to this at all that really makes it stick to your lid. So I tried using this as a bit of like glitter on my inner lower lash line, and it just didn't work at all. It just wouldn't stick. Maybe with a glitter glue it might, because it does have that glittery sort of texture, but the gold in this didn't have that problem at all. So I'm not sure what went wrong with the silver in this. Some more Urban Decay, the Urban Decay Naked Smoky. Now, I think that the quality of the shades in this palette is absolutely phenomenal. I have no issue with the quality of these eyeshadows. What I do have an issue with is how dark this runs. When I bought this, I was like, ooh, that dark purple looks really nice. Well, guess what? If you're fair-skinned like me, a dark purple like this just pulls black on your skin. So it's just not really useful that way. It looks all right now, but you see from a distance how dark it looks? So on the eye, when it's even less concentrated, it just looks like a black on my skin, and it doesn't look purple enough. So it doesn't really give me like what I was hoping for when I looked at it. It looks like a deep purple in the pan. On me, it looks like a black. Let's just tackle black eyeshadow then. And just a case in point, as an example for all black eyeshadow, I think I pulled out my Lorac Pro 1. Lorac, I think, has a black in pretty much every one of their Pro palettes. As you can see in this palette, the black doesn't look very used. And that's because I don't use black eyeshadow because it looks a little too stark on my skin, I find. Like, I'm pretty fair, and I just find that a black is just a little bit too harsh. It just doesn't create a nice smoky effect on my skin. It just looks like a black hole. So that's why any black eyeshadow, but I'm just showing you this as an example, but any black eyeshadow in any palette I have is always going to be my least used one. This is a nice black eyeshadow. It's not the blackest black you will ever find. It is a little bit like a softer black, I would say, but it's a nice black eyeshadow. It's just that I don't use black eyeshadow. Pulling out something from the drugstore again. This was also sent to me from that swap that I did with Stashy from Canada. This is the Rosé in the Air by Wet n Wild, and I was super excited when I received this because everybody loves Wet n Wild eyeshadows. I decluttered the Petal Pusher palette that I used to own a long time ago because I didn't like the quality of it. And I have the same issue with this. I think that these are pretty powdery, and I had a major issue with this nice bright berry color. It's so scratchy and tough. It has nice pigmentation, but let me put it over here. But my issue with this shade was that it didn't stick to my lid. It just wouldn't hang in there. It just wouldn't go on, and let alone that it would build and show up on my lid to begin with. So while this looks like a nice shade, it's just a little bit scratchy, a little bit dry, and it just didn't really work on my eyes. The Tarte Tartelette Toasted palette also has one of those weird like matte with a shimmer shades right here called Crackle. Again, a really nice shade in the pan, but it just doesn't really, let me put it here because you can see that a little bit better. It's pretty, and in the swatch you get the shimmer, but like with the Too Faced shade, I feel that the shimmer disappears the minute I start blending this out. So this is just not my favorite shade. I really like the quality of these Tarte palettes. I love the In Bloom, that's one of my all-time favorites. And in terms of warm tones, I really like the Toasted palette, but that Crackle shade is just one I never reach for. Let's talk about some more shimmery whites. Juvia's Place has one of the best formulas for shimmers in their eyeshadow palettes, and this is the Saharan by Juvia's, and I really like this palette. I'm not a big fan of warm tones, but this I love. The only shade I feel doesn't work in this palette is the shimmery white in the middle. To me, it would have been better if this were like some sort of like a champagne, if it had a bit more of a warmer undertone, because everything else in here is quite warm, which means that it just kind of stands out, and that's why it doesn't really work on my skin very well either. Let me pick a finger. It's amazing quality. It looks really nice, but it's so bright, it's almost a silver, and I feel it just doesn't really go with the rest of the palette. So even though I think the shade has nice quality, in contrast with the Essence shade I showed you, which is just sheer and more of a topper, this has a really nice white base to it and then a lot of shimmer. They do shimmers very well, like I said, but this is just within the color story of the palette. I don't really understand why it's in here, to be quite honest. So I would have preferred to have a very nice shimmery champagne, more of like a beige undertone. I think it would have worked a lot better. Sticking to shadows that don't really work within the palette, Zoeva Cocoa Blend also has a nice warm undertone to it, except for this. Why is this in it? It's called Delicate Acidity, and it's like a purpley taupe, and I have no clue how it's in here. I seem to have used it a little bit, definitely more than the Infusion shade next to it. But it's just, in terms of this palette, I tend to go for these three at the top and these three at the bottom, and that's about it. But this shade, it is a nice shade. It's on my ring finger, by the way. My middle finger is a bit dirty. It's right there. In terms of what it does within the palette, it just doesn't really work. It's just such a odd shade to have in this very warm tone palette. So that's something that I feel doesn't really work. This would have been a really great shade in the On Taupe, which, if you know, it's one of my favorite cool tone palettes. It's very cool toned, but it's very samey, and this shade would have looked perfect in that palette, I think. Urban Decay doesn't just do weird shimmer shades, because that's, I think, something they're known for, especially in their Vice palettes. But from my Vice one, the shade that I like the least is actually this bright matte electric blue. This is called Chaos. It looks stunning in the pan. It looks stunning in a really intense swatch. There's glitter all over this thing. But then when you put it on, it's just a bit lackluster. Like, it just doesn't seem to pack as much of a punch. It's a little patchy up here where you sort of, like, it's not entirely smooth. In terms of a matte, vibrant blue, I've heard someone say that they are very hard to formulate well. This works really well if you have like a really dense brush and like really smudge it onto your lower lash line. That's pretty much the only way you can wear this. Try to tap it all over your lid and it's just going to be patch central. It's just not a really great shade. An eyeshadow palette that was a complete dud overall for me is the Rimmel Magnif'Eyes eyeshadow palettes. That's probably the reason why these weren't around for a very long time, because these came into the drugstore and then like within a couple of months they were gone, because I think Rimmel also realized that it wasn't really great. I mainly bought it because it has a really nice copper. However, this is hard pan already too. Like, it looks really nice, but I remember when I tried to put this on, look at that. That's the shittiest swatch ever. And I was like going down, up and down in that hard. It is almost a sticky formula and my brush barely picked it up and then it wouldn't transfer onto my eye. I had such a hard time making this shade work. It's just also not that great. It just really like cakes together. I've never heard of anyone describing an eyeshadow as cakey, but that's how I would describe this eyeshadow from Rimmel. It's an absolute mess. Some more drugstore then. This is the NYX Ultimate Brights palette, and I think that if you're looking for a good starter palette, if you want to get into brights, this is really nice. The only issue I had is with a couple of the shades up here. I think it was especially this corally shade here. It wouldn't really stick to my eye. So again, as with the, what was it that I can't remember which one it was. But this, oh, the Wet n Wild shadow. This just didn't really stick to my skin. Even now, it just kind of blends away into nothing. It's right here. And it's just a bit sheer. I feel that all of these shadows are quite sheer in this palette, but they work well over a white base, or if you just use anything like a paint pot to really make them work. But I felt that this, the minute I started blending it, it would kind of disappear, and I really had to pack it on to make sure it really became this punchy color that it is in the palette. Almost there. This is the Too Faced Sweet Peach, and again, as I said, Too Faced is known for doing these weird like mattes with shimmers in their palettes. This is a shade right here, Talk Derby to me. It looks like a really intense, vibrant purple, blackened purple with like pink shimmer running through it. On me, this just looks like a black. It just, and it's so weird. It's supposed to look a little purpley. It doesn't at all. It's like a black. So in the pan and how it goes on are two completely different things. I think that nobody really likes this shade very much. Last but not least, another Urban Decay one. And the shade I'm going to mention is actually also in another palette. This is the Alice in Wonderland collection, and in this palette, you get a couple of really, really pretty pops of color. I really like this row here, which is the Mad Hatter one, I believe. Yeah, this is the one dedicated to the Mad Hatter. Really, really nice shades. But this light blue called Metamorphosis, it's also in the full spectrum. It's really, really sheer, and it just doesn't really apply very well. However, let me swatch it first. So as you can see, it just looks very powdery. It's almost like the same thing as with the Chaos shade. It has that same sort of issue. However, what I have found is that Kiko do an eyeshadow stick, and it's exactly this color. So what I do, if I want to use a shade, I first layer the eyeshadow stick on, and then I layer this on, and then it works really well. But it is a shade that makes you work quite hard to get the payoff that you see in the pan. So ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this video. I'm going to be washing off these swatches in a minute, and those are my least favorite shades in the palette. You can definitely, there isn't much rhyme or reason to it, not like in the other video where it was all like rose golds, and that's what I like. But there is definitely a good mishmash of like different shades, different textures, different formulas, different reasons why I don't really like these or reach for these shades. And yeah, so that's my least favorite shade in the palette. I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and I would love for you to subscribe to my channel. It really helps me with growing my audience, getting my videos out there, and I really enjoy seeing everybody who has been subscribing to my channel in the past year. I really love having you here, and yeah, without further ado, I really hope you have a great day, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.